who is the real boss of your life? Just think about that for a second.
Yeah, it's an intimidating question when you really sit with it.
Right. I mean, if you had to point to the person or like the institution holding the ultimate power over your day-to-day existence, you probably picture the person signing your paycheck.
Oh, absolutely. Or maybe you picture the government, the politicians drafting legislation, the agencies collecting your taxes.
Exactly. We all operate under this deeply ingrained assumption that power basically flows from the top down. But the source material we are exploring in today's deep dive completely flips that assumption on its head.
It really does. It takes the entire top-down model of society and it inverts it.
So let's get into it. The sources we're looking at today are a series of transcribed lectures. These were delivered in Argentina back in 1959 by the renowned economist Ludwig von Mises.
Right, and they were later compiled into the book Economic Policy. Thoughts for today and tomorrow.
And the mission for our deep dive today is to really unpack these lectures to understand his core arguments. We want to look at capitalism, socialism, interventionism, but strip away all the academic jargon.
Yeah, to see how these economic systems fundamentally alter the day-to-day realities of your personal freedoms, your choices, and, well, even your survival.
But before we dive in, we should probably set some ground rules for how we're approaching this.
Definitely. It's important to note right off the bat that these texts contain some very strong critiques of various political and economic systems, including Marxism and state intervention.
Right. Very strong opinions in here.
Yeah, and to be clear to you listening, our role here isn't to endorse these viewpoints. We're just here to impartially break down Mises' historical and economic arguments so you can evaluate the ideas for yourself.
Spot on. Okay, let's unpack this. Because Mises starts by dismantling the most common myth we have about modern capitalism.
The idea that business owners are the rulers of society.
Yes, exactly. The idea that the billionaires, the CEOs, are these unquestioned kings. He introduces this really vivid concept of the chocolate king.
I love that analogy.
It's great. He says, unlike a feudal king from the Middle Ages who rules by birthright, or, a conqueror who rules by military force, a modern chocolate king or a steel king or an auto king doesn't actually rule anything.
Right, because a feudal lord is completely insulated from the market. I mean, they extract wealth through force and taxation, regardless of whether their subjects actually like them or not.
You don't get to vote out the duke.
Exactly. But a chocolate king, on the other hand, only retains their kingdom on the condition that they continuously serve the consumers.
Because if a rival comes along, right?
Yeah, if a rival comes along and offers a slightly better chocolate bar, or even just a cheaper chocolate bar, that king loses their crown almost overnight.
Which is wild to think about.
Their entire empire is entirely dependent on the daily whims of the people buying the product.
But it is incredibly easy to be blind to this dynamic because of what we visibly see in an office or a factory.
You see that blindness perfectly illustrated in the story of Beatrice Webb.
Right. She later became Lady Passfield, yeah.
Yes. So as a young woman, she worked as a secretary for her father, who was this very wealthy British businessman. And in her memoirs, she described her father as an absolute, unquestioned dictator.
Because she was just sitting there watching him give orders all day.
Precisely. From her vantage point sitting in his office, she only ever heard him giving orders to his managers and his clerks. Nobody ever walked into that office and gave him an order.
So she just saw a self-contained corporate fiefdom where her father was the absolute monarch.
Right. But to understand why she was completely wrong, we have to borrow a concept from the French economist Frédéric Bastiat.
The seen versus the unseen idea.
Exactly. The concept of what is seen and what is not seen. Beatrice Webb saw the visible, spoken orders her father gave to his staff. What she could not see, because they were entirely invisible, were the relentless orders being handed down to her father by the consumers.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, every single time a customer decided to buy or pass on his products, they were silently dictating every decision he made. The consumers were the ones deciding what the factory produced, how many workers were hired, what materials were bought.
Hold on, though. I look around today and it feels like a massive stretch to call the consumer the boss. I mean, people are relentlessly targeted by billion-dollar advertising campaigns. They're trapped by monopolies, manipulated by algorithms. Are we really just passive buyers being told what to want?
Well, Mises would argue that even with all that marketing, the ultimate veto power remains with the buyer. I mean, advertising is just an attempt to persuade the boss.
Persuade the boss. That's an interesting way to phrase it.
Just think of the monumental corporate failures out there. Massive companies launching products with millions in marketing, only for the product to fail completely because the consumer simply refused to buy it.
Like the new Coke debacle.
Exactly like that. The enterprise, no matter how large or established, possesses zero power to legally force you to hand over your money.
It's almost like, it sounds like you're saying the CEO is actually just a highly stressed elected official.
That's a great way to put it.
And every single dollar we spend is a ruthless ballot. Like, if we stop voting for them, they lose their office overnight.
That's exactly it. In a market economy, you are the supreme sovereign. When you patronize a business, you are literally granting them their mandate to exist.
So the boss isn't the guy with his name on the building.
No, the ultimate boss isn't the person signing the payroll. It's the person paying for the product, which in turn funds the payroll.
That is a really wild shift in perspective, but it immediately introduces a really messy problem.
Oh, for sure.
If the consumer is the ultimate boss, what happens when the boss makes terrible choices? Because people voluntarily buy things that destroy their health, their finances, their lives all the time.
Yeah, and this brings us to a crucial pivot in Mises' argument. Being the sovereign comes with certain realities. He argues you cannot separate economic freedom from personal freedom.
Right. He actually says that being the sovereign means retaining the right to be foolish, which is such a striking phrase.
It really is.
He points to prohibition in the United States as his big example. The government called it a noble experiment, right? And the foundational logic was that the state needed to step in to stop citizens from destroying their own bodies and families with alcohol.
Which, to be fair, drinking in excess is objectively harmful.
Absolutely. But Mises poses the question, if you grant the state the authority to control your physical consumption in order to save you from yourself, what is the logical starting point?
Right, if we connect this to the bigger picture, once a government establishes the precedent that it can control what you put into your body, it will inevitably claim the right to control what you put into your mind.
That escalated quickly.
Well, because you can easily argue that consuming bad ideas, toxic ideologies, or, dangerous philosophies is far more destabilizing to a society than a bottle of bad whiskey.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
The historical example Mises uses here is stark. He points to Adolf Hitler.
Right.
Before seizing power, Hitler was a failed postcard painter, rejected by the Art Academy in Vienna. But once he possessed absolute governmental authority, he used the machinery of the state to outlaw any art he personally deemed degenerate or bad.
So essentially a guy with a personal grudge against modern art suddenly became the ultimate indisputable art critic, but backed by a police force.
Exactly. And this control always extends to the press. Mises makes a brilliant mechanical point here about that.
Oh, about the printing presses.
Yeah. He says freedom of the press is functionally impossible without economic freedom. You can write the most beautiful guarantees of free speech into a constitution, but if the state owns all the paper mills, all the ink factories, and all the printing presses...
Those constitutional guarantees are basically worthless.
Completely worthless. You can only print what the state allocates resources for you to print.
But wait, isn't it the government's duty to act as a guardian on some basic level to save us from our own destructive habits?
It's a common argument.
I mean, it feels like we are choosing between treating adults like toddlers who need, every sharp corner in the sandbox covered in foam versus treating them like adults who are fully allowed to touch a hot stove and burn themselves.
And Mises lands unapologetically on the side of the hot stove. He is arguing to you, the listener, that participating in a truly free society requires a heavy psychological burden.
Because you have to watch people do things you hate.
Yes, exactly. It means accepting that your neighbors will do things you absolutely despise.
Yeah.
They will read trashy books, they will eat garbage, they will squander their money.
And you just have to let them.
In a free society, your only legitimate tool for changing your behavior is persuasion. You have to write a better book, give a compelling speech, maybe preach on a street corner. You do not get to call the police to force them to live according to your values.
Wow.
The fundamental core of freedom is the freedom to make catastrophic mistakes.
Okay, so if capitalism is the engine that grants this individual freedom, this right to be foolish and dictate society with your wallet, why was it so universally despised when it first emerged?
That's the big question.
I mean, why did brilliant thinkers like Karl Marx predict it would be the downfall of humanity?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at the origins of the Industrial Revolution and dismantle one of the most persistent historical myths we cling to.
Right, because we have this incredibly romanticized image of the 1800s. We picture factory workers as these previously happy people who were violently plucked from an idyllic, comfortable life on the family farm and just shoved into grimy, dangerous factories.
Right, the whole pastoral myth.
But according to the source, pre-capitalist Europe was a rigidly closed system. The population was exploding, which created millions of landless outcasts.
And there was literally no land left for them to farm. The urban guilds rigidly blocked them from learning trades.
So these millions of people weren't living idyllic lives. They were quite literally starving to death in the streets and fields.
Exactly. And capitalism wasn't born by producing luxury goods for kings. It was born when innovators figured out how to mass-produce cheap goods specifically for these starving masses.
Oh, wow. So they were the target demographic from the start.
Yes. And the initial visceral hatred for capitalism didn't actually come from those impoverished workers. It came directly from the landed aristocracy.
Wait, really? Why the aristocrats?
Pure, cold economics. To attract these starving outcasts into the new factories, the mill owners had to pay wages that were slightly higher than what a peasant could scrape together doing agricultural labor.
Ah, so they were poaching the cheap labor.
Exactly. Suddenly, the aristocrats realized their cheap labor force was abandoning the estates. To keep their workers, the nobles were forced to actually raise wages.
So it was a direct threat to the wealth and power of the old nobility.
Right, and the sources detail how the aristocracy fought back using the state. In Britain, they implemented something called the Speenham land system.
Speenham land, what was that?
Basically, the landed gentry didn't want to pay the higher market wages to compete with the factories. So they had the government subsidize the low agricultural wages using poor rates.
So it was a massive intervention just to artificially bridge the gap.
Exactly, trapping the laborers on the farm so the aristocrats wouldn't lose their workforce.
Yeah.
Mises also shows this really revealing anecdote about Chancellor Bismarck in Germany.
Oh, the beer garden story. I love this one.
Yeah. Bismarck was talking to a Prussian Junker, a wealthy aristocratic landowner who was complaining bitterly about Landflucht, which is the phenomenon of peasants fleeing the countryside.
And the landowner asked a former worker why he abandoned the estate for Berlin, right?
Right. And the worker replied that the village didn't have the nice beer gardens they had in Berlin, where a man could sit, drink beer, and listen to music after a hard day's work.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me because it brings up Marx. It's almost like Marx viewed the working class the same way a biologist looks at a petri dish of bacteria.
That is a perfect analogy.
He built his entire theory on the iron law of wages, claiming that under capitalism, wages would never permanently rise above the bare minimum required to keep a worker alive.
Right.
Like if you give bacteria more food, they just multiply until the food is gone and then they starve again.
Yes, the iron law of wages.
But Marx completely missed the human element. We don't just want bare survival. We want shoes, we want homes, and, we want to sit in a beer garden and listen to music.
He completely missed it. He assumed any increase in wages would simply result in workers having more children, increasing the labor supply, and driving wages right back down to starvation levels.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. The historical reality shattered his prediction. The population of England skyrocketed from roughly 6 million to over 50 million under early capitalism, and yet the standard of living simultaneously exploded upward.
Which completely defies the iron law.
Entirely. Mises points to an anecdote about Benjamin Franklin visiting a British cotton mill. Franklin saw the workers in shabby clothes and asked the owner why he wasn't producing cotton goods for his own people, but instead exporting them to places like Hungary.
Right, because on the surface, that looks like pure exploitation. Like the workers are making clothes they can't even afford to wear.
But the mill owner explained the hidden economic mechanism. England didn't grow cotton, and more importantly, it couldn't grow enough food to sustain its booming population.
Oh, so they were trading for survival. Exactly. The mill owner was proudly exporting that cloth to pay for the massive imports of food from Eastern Europe that were literally keeping those 50 million British citizens alive.
Yeah.
The factory system was generating the capital required to feed a population that would have otherwise starved to death under the old feudal system.
So if humans naturally desire progress and a better standard of living, how do these different economic models handle innovation and human ambition?
It's a huge distinction.
Because before capitalism, your status was permanently locked. In the Middle Ages, you inherited your caste. You were born a serf, you died a serf.
Right, but capitalism introduced what the sociologist Vilfredo Pareto called this circulation of the elites.
Yes, the source has this striking anecdote from a bookstore in Buenos Aires.
Mises is looking at a biography of a towering European industrial titan from the 19th century, a man who built a massive empire.
But Mises actually knows that titan's grandson.
Right. And the grandson isn't a titan. He's a poor photographer struggling to make rent in New York. And then you contrast that with someone like Henry Ford, who started with practically nothing but a few borrowed dollars and built the largest industrial enterprise on the planet.
The elites are constantly churning.
Right.
And that constant circulation requires a system where individuals are free to test their own ideas against the market. In a socialist system, planning doesn't mean you get to plan your own life. It means central planning.
Which means the entire nation is structured like an army. You don't choose your profession. You wait for orders from the top.
Which raises an important question. How does a central committee handle new ideas? Paradigm-shifting innovation.
Because if a foot soldier has a brilliant idea, they have to convince the general.
Exactly. And historical experts have an absolutely abysmal track record of predicting the future.
So true.
Mises notes that Napoleon, who is obviously one of the greatest military minds in history, completely rejected the steamship. He simply couldn't comprehend a heavy ship navigating the ocean without sails.
He thought it was nonsense.
Yeah. And before World War I, the elite German and French general staffs dismissed aviation. They thought airplanes were just a pleasure toy for idle rich people.
Because they only believed in giant zeppelins.
Right. And consider the arts. If Vincent van Gogh's survival relied on a government committee of artistic experts deciding if he was a worthwhile allocation of state resources,
oh, man,
they would have looked at this erratic, difficult man and sent him to work in a milk factory or committed him to a madhouse. They certainly wouldn't have funded his art.
But isn't it technically more efficient to have the smartest people in the room making the blueprint for society? I mean, it's like trying to navigate a sprawling, ever-changing city using one map drawn by a guy in a tower versus millions of people using their own real-time GPS.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Because the guy in the tower is bound to miss a traffic jam, right? He can't possibly see the accident that just happened 5 seconds ago.
That GPS analogy perfectly illustrates the single most profound argument Mises makes against central planning. The calculation problem.
The calculation problem.
Yes, this is the insurmountable mechanical failure of pure socialism.
Let's really look at the mechanics of this. Because you can have a team of brilliant engineers draw up a dozen different blueprints for a new bridge, right? They can say, technologically, we can build it out of steel, out of concrete, or out of aluminum.
But the engineers can't tell you which bridge should be built.
Right. It's the businessman who has to calculate which project actually makes economic sense for society.
And the businessman makes that calculation using prices. In a market economy, prices act as an incredibly complex, continuous information network.
Like the GPS system.
Exactly. The money price of raw materials, the price of concrete, the wages for labor, these aren't just arbitrary numbers. They are signals broadcasting what the consumers value most urgently at that exact second.
Oh, I see. So if the price of steel suddenly skyrockets...
It's the market's way of flashing a red light, telling the businessman, society urgently needs this steel for something else right now. Like building hospitals. Build your bridge out of concrete instead.
So the moment you abolish the free market and ban private ownership, you destroy that entire price mechanism.
You rip out the wiring of the information network. Without market-driven money prices, the central planner has literally no way to calculate cost or efficiency.
They're flying blind.
Completely blind. They might build the bridge out of steel, completely unaware that they are starving a vital industry somewhere else in the country. The early socialists eventually realized this was a gaping hole in their theory.
Did they try to fix it?
Well, their proposed solution was to simply play market. They thought the Central Committee could just artificially simulate prices.
How does that even work?
Mises dismisses it entirely. He compares it to children playing school. It's a pantomime. You don't learn anything because the real stakes, the actual sacrifices and choices of the consumers, are completely absent.
Wow. The sources even point out that the Soviet Union only managed to function for as long as it did because it could peak at the prices on the global capitalist market to do their planning.
Right. They weren't a globally closed system. They looked at the price of wheat or copper in Chicago or London and used those capitalist numbers to manage their internal socialist planning.
They were basically blindly drafting off the calculation engine of the free world.
Exactly.
So
What does this all mean for the middle ground? Because most people aren't advocating for Soviet-style central planning, but they also get very nervous about an entirely unregulated free market. They want a mixed economy.
That's a very popular stance today.
They want the government to run the post office, maybe the railroads. Mises uses an analogy here about gasoline. Gasoline is a highly useful liquid. It runs our cars, but you wouldn't drink it.
Right.
Similarly, he argues government is essential for protecting citizens from domestic gangsters and foreign enemies. He calls it producing security, but it is not fit for running businesses.
Because it operates under an entirely different set of incentives than a private enterprise.
But what about a mixed economy? Isn't the government just being a referee? Like, in a sports game, you need someone on the field making sure nobody cheats.
Well, Mises entirely rejects the referee concept when it comes to interventionism. According to the source, state-run railways are not just a little bit of socialism existing peacefully within a market.
Why not?
They are still operating within the market. They just almost universally run at a massive deficit. A private businessman who runs a deficit goes bankrupt, right? The market liquidates his operation because he is wasting resources.
But the government doesn't go bankrupt.
No, when a government enterprise runs a deficit, it simply uses the threat of force to tax the citizens to cover the loss. It is not a neutral referee. Through interventionism like subsidizing failing industries or imposing price controls during inflation, the state is actively trying to restrict the supremacy of the consumer. It is legally forcing the businessman to disobey the invisible orders of the market.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We've seen how capitalism transformed a rigid, starving world into one of mass production and social mobility, placing the consumer on the throne.
The chocolate king.
Exactly. And we've seen how central planning creates an innovation bottleneck and how interventionism attempts to overrule the daily votes we cast with our wallets.
And Mises leaves us with one incredibly striking visual contrast to drive all of this home.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about.
In the United States, or any free market economy, you walk into a store, buy some goods, and as you leave, you see a sign on the door that reads, "Thank you for your patronage."
All right.
The seller is expressing gratitude to you, the sovereign boss, for keeping them in business. But in a totalitarian socialist state, that dynamic is completely reversed. It is the buyer who must be grateful and thank the great leader simply for allowing them to have the goods.
It just completely flips the power dynamic of daily survival, and it leaves you, the listener, with a deeply provocative thought to mull over.
What's it?
If our wallets are our ballots, and every single dollar we spend shapes the world, what happens when we stop paying attention to what we're voting for? Because if the market gives us exactly what we demand, the most terrifying question might not be whether the government is secretly controlling us.
Right.
The most terrifying question might be, what does our daily consumption say about who we really are? Think about that the next time you swipe your card. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.